Let's talk about all of this with Hadley Heath Manning, the Independent Women's Forum Policy Director. And also, Douglas Holtz-Eakin joins us, economist and former CBO director, where I guess your head would spin, right, Doug? We can start with you with all the numbers we're talking about in terms of spending under this new administration. But what do you make of it? Do you think they'll be able to get a lot of this through with Democratic control of the Senate? That's what the market is trying to gauge here.
Well, I think it's going to depend on whether they can make the case on the merits. I think if you look at today's jobs report, Edward Lawrence had it exactly right. We saw a loss of 500,000 jobs in leisure and hospitality that are directly related to the surge in COVID-19 infections. Those will disappear going forward. The remainder of the economy continues to climb out of what was a very deep hole, but construction is about 3% below where it was a year ago, manufacturing about 4%. We're making steady progress in recovering from the 9 percentage point decline we saw in March and April of 2020. And so, you need to support those who have been out of work for a long time and try to target relief on their financial needs. But the larger economy has received 9% of GDP in stimulus in the CARES Act, about another 4% in the most recent. So we're at a 13% of GDP response to a 9% decline. 2 or 3 trillion more? Can you make that case? I think it's going to be a tough sell.
They're going to try to. It's going to be a tough sell, it sounds like, Hadley, with the likes of Joe Manchin, who will be a powerful figure, it seems like, in this new Congress as a centrist Democrat from West Virginia. But, and this is another point that Edward even if Joe Manchin doesn't necessarily support this, you might get some Republicans who are in support of the $2,000 stimulus checks. What do you make of that policy in general, giving out that much money to people?
You know, any sort of stimulus that we're talking about ought to be targeted, ought to be temporary, and it ought to be geared at the folks who need help the most. You know, unfortunately, Washington, D.C. has a way of trying to include one-size-fits-all solutions for problems that are actually a lot more complicated. And it's no surprise what we've seen in this jobs report, leisure and hospitality taking a big hit. Americans in their spending behaviors and habits are really treating this pandemic as if it is a temporary set of circumstances. That's why people continued to spend so much during the holidays on gifts, even if they were unemployed. And that's why I think that there's a lot of pent-up demand for a lot of these services. I wonder if we won't see lines out the doors of restaurants this summer, because if you're like me, you're dying to eat out, but you just haven't had that chance recently.
Right. Well, I agree with you, and I think there's a lot of that out there on the pent-up demand argument. But, Doug, for the actual restaurants themselves, it seems, and we talk to these restaurant owners all the time, like a long way from now until whenever that pent-up demand is unleashed. And that kind of bridge loan that however we structure that to get them from here until then, and, allow them to survive, essentially, something has to be done there, right? I mean, and if so, what is that targeted approach, especially with restaurants?
So I think that's exactly right, Connell. There's a big difference between looking at the economy as a whole and looking at those specific sectors, especially the restaurants. I mean, they're just in a world of hurt. About a quarter of them have closed since the pandemic hit, and others are at the edge of financial survival. I think, again, we saw the Congress re-up the Paycheck Protection Program. That was very effective at both keeping small businesses like restaurants in business and keeping their employees attached to those restaurants and getting a paycheck. So they've done the right thing. They have to keep an eye on it, make sure that the take-up and the funding is adequate. And if they have to go back, add some more. That's the recipe.
All right, one last word, Hadley. Are you optimistic overall of where we are, at least economically? I mean, it's been a rough week in this country in so many ways, but are you optimistic? Can you at least leave us with that on a Friday, that better days are ahead?
I am an eternal optimist, maybe, and my husband just got a second dose of the Pfizer vaccine, so I'm starting to feel like there's a light at the end of this tunnel, and there's a lot of reasons for optimism. You could look at a lot of economic indicators and make that case for something positive, but overall, yes, this is a very unique time, and we've talked about the restaurant industry. It's a very competitive industry, even absent a pandemic, and that's one reason why maybe I'll finish by saying it's a terrible idea to raise the minimum wage and make it that much harder on people who work in sectors like leisure and hospitality to get a job in the first place.
Right, because the overall number of employees then might go down, even if the few who are the ones who are working are making more. That's the argument we've had for years and years. Hadley, thank you. Doug, good to see you as well.